gavel. Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter @London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using the hashtag #AssemblyRegeneration. Our main topic of discussion is the GLA culture team and place-based cultural initiatives. But first, we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we get to our guests. Please make sure your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this afternoon. Item 1, Teresa, can I start by asking you if we have any apologises received, please?
Thank you, Chairman. There's one apology from Assembly Member Dismore.
Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2, please? And can I ask Assembly members to declare any other interest, disclosable pecuniary interest, and any other relevant interests, please?
None.
None? Okay, thank you. And item 3, can we note the standing delegation of authority to me as chair, as set out in the agenda, was agreed, obviously, with my deputy chair of the London Assembly plenary meeting of the 6th of June 2019. And minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of our meeting held on the 8th of May, please? Thank you. And summary of actions. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee, please?
Noted.
Thank you. And we get on to the main business. So, a discussion on the culture team and place-based culture initiatives. Can I welcome our guests? It says on my minutes they're going to introduce themselves, but I'm going to introduce them anyway quickly. So we've got Councillor Matthew Bennett on the left, Cabinet Member for Planning, Investment, New Homes, Lambeth Council. If you want to add anything, please do.
No, I think that title's long enough.
Thank you. And we have Shonagh Manson, Assistant Director, Culture and Creative Industries at the GLA. Welcome home, team.
Thank you.
And Rachel Rose, Senior Policy Officer, Culture Infrastructure, GLA, who will be attending for the first part of the meeting to give a demonstration. So we're going to go straight on to the demonstration, I believe. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I've been asked today to present on the cultural infrastructure map. The cultural infrastructure map is only one element of the cultural infrastructure plan, and Shonagh is going to unpack the cultural infrastructure plan as a whole for you later. To develop the cultural infrastructure map, we undertook a large-scale data collection exercise, and we developed the map as a way of being able to show all of this data in context and make it really user-friendly, particularly for those boroughs involved in planning and development decisions. To develop it, we held workshops with local authorities and other stakeholders who would be using it, and there are now nearly 30,000 data points on the map, with over 30 categories, and it has had over 5,000 hits since we first launched it a few months ago. I'm hoping that we can switch to the interactive screen now so I can demonstrate some of the tools in the map for you. So first and foremost, all the data which sits behind the map is available on our data store, and that is very useful for a variety of users. And then the map itself can be found on our website, and it has over 30 different categories, as I was saying, on the left-hand side here, from artist workspace right through to legal street art walls, libraries, and makerspaces. So we can switch on some of those layers for you to see. We also have a number of context layers, so you can see cultural infrastructure sitting alongside transport, for example. So this is the tube lines that we can bring in here, as well as switching on layers like libraries, for example. There's planning policy layers, so you can look at housing areas, you can look at town centres, audience and demographics, so we've purchased data from the audience agency, so you can look at the propensity for people to purchase tickets in an area. You can look at the future in terms of projected population growth and job growth, as well as open spaces. So we've brought all that context alongside the cultural infrastructure data. I'm going to demonstrate some more kind of real-life scenarios now in the way that you might use the map. So there are a number of tools that we've built in because when workshopping, the borough specifically asked for them. So one of them is a borough comparison tool. So we need to click on a library, for example. You can then select a borough that you might be interested in. and then select a comparative borough. The data then comes up on the chart on the right-hand side, which will tell you how many libraries that, I'm sorry, you can't quite see it because unfortunately it's falling off the screen a little bit, but underneath there that it tells you the number of libraries in the borough both boroughs that you've selected. So that's one tool that boroughs particularly ask for in order to benchmark themselves against other boroughs and understand what the rest of London looked like. I'll just refresh that and move on to another tool that we developed. Particularly I'll look at a borough like Hackney, for example. The Lasso tool was developed so you could specifically look at exact geographic areas. So if a planning application came in, for example, and you wanted to understand exactly what was in that particular area, you can draw around it. And again, you can extract that data and put that into any kind of planning format that you'd like. So it can be part of master planning, for example. It works on small or large scale areas, so you can click and move this tool around. And again, thinking of the end user, that's the reason why that we added in the download function, so it can be used in any format. Further use of this data could be looking at perhaps a CZ. So if we choose Lambeth, for example, it makes sense today, I think.
Please check that.
And if we look at the Lambeth CZ area, which is Brixton, for example, again, you can draw around that area and download it and understand the complexity of the existing cultural infrastructure you have and look at how you might want to develop that. We are working with all of the CEZs at the moment to include a CEZ layer on the map, and they'll be working with us to contribute to the map as well, so it's a reciprocal data exchange there. Finally, if you are looking to develop a new site, for example, just using Bexley here, thinking about Thamesmead, for example, you might be thinking about perhaps a new performance venue like theatre, for example. This enables you to look at where existing theatres are. So you can see you have one here, but also you have some nearby in Woolwich as well. You might then move to switch on one of the context layers, for example, around, let's look at audience and demographics, for example. So you can then see that in Bexley there are some theatres already, and you can also see that the propensity for purchasing tickets, the lighter colour there, shows that actually currently it's quite low. So that gives you more information than you might previously have had in terms of making future development decisions. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot more housing built there, so you would then build on that evidence that you've been given. Finally, just taking the map back to the beginning again. To suggest a facility, this is a crowdsourcing map, so we've started this as an exercise which gives the best possible snapshot that we could of London's cultural infrastructure. But we are actively seeking crowdsourcing information, so you can suggest a facility as well. So it's a very user-friendly way of letting us know what cultural infrastructure might not be on the map already, and then that's moderated by the team.
Great, thank you very much for that, and thank you for being so succinct. Always helps at these meetings. So starting with our questions, we'll start, if we could, with Shonagh. What happens next with the cultural infrastructure map? How will you keep it up to date, please?
Absolutely. It might be worth me just recapping, as the Creative Tensions report sets out so brilliantly why we need one. I think it is worth us going back to that. We know, and as your report showed, that cultural infrastructure is under huge amounts of pressure. So we have to be sensitive to how that change is operating all around us. And I think what Rachel has just demonstrated to us is that we are now in a situation in which we have much faster paced data, and data that is not only of value to the GLA, but has been shaped by the boroughs for their uses. So it's really important to us that we are working really closely with the boroughs on that to populate it to its fullest propensity, and to make sure that a real diversity of cultural infrastructure is represented on that map. It's really important that it's open source, and so we will go through an engagement process, expanding on the work that we've done already, road showing out there with our borough partners in the borough to raise awareness of it, to build more entries into the map, We'll continue to focus on populating it with data, with the studies and the research that we're doing. I mean, what we've identified in our studies already is that we've experienced, near catastrophic losses actually. We've lost 61% of LGBT plus venues between 2006 and 2016, and in actual fact, the research last year showed that that data had stabilised for the first time. A similar picture amongst grassroots music venues, 35% lost in the decade, and again, a stabilisation for the first time last year. We know that we've got continually moving artist workspace data, and we'll come, I'm sure, more to the initiatives around increasing that workspace later. Pub numbers fell by 27% between 2001 and 2007, so there is constant change and constant flux that we need to map through this and be able to wave the flags and bring the right stakeholders together. So that stakeholder engagement is going to be really important. There is data that we are, there's some data that we're commissioning ourselves, but mostly we're trying wherever possible to work with the industry leaders in that area. So for example, the theatres data is a partnership with the Theatres Trust. The pubs data is a partnership with CAMRA. So those strategic partnerships are really important. There will be updated LGBT plus venues coming out very shortly next month. So we'll be looking and we'll be able to share information about the trends in those again. All of that data informs our Culture at Risk office and the casework that we're doing. We've seen 350 cases since that was established in 2016. I've no doubt that we could see more, and we prioritise really well amongst that, and we've had some really fantastic successes through that, particularly around, I know that the Creative Tensions report was absolutely right in identifying that it is the smaller venues which need that support, which are really at risk. So there's been a really strong focus around grassroots music venues, independent venues, LGBT plus venues, small pub theatres, the kinds of cases which really need that support. They might be lacking in understanding of how to negotiate licensing conversations or rent negotiations. There are many ways that we can help in those circumstances.
Thank you very much. And how will you monitor whether boroughs are using the cultural infrastructure map and whether it is meeting their needs, please?
Well, we've got a number of forums for doing that. One of the most important, actually, is the Nighttime Borough Champions Network. So that's a really engaged network now. Every borough is engaged through that. We've been discussing the map with them. We also work really closely and fund and support the London Culture Forum with London councils. So again, we have a really great route through. They've been hugely involved in the development of the whole culture strategy, not just the cultural infrastructure plan. So through regular conversation, absolutely, it's hugely important. I mean, they're a really important stakeholder.
But so how you saying that all? My next question is: how many boroughs have the cultural infrastructure map policies in their plans or planning to incorporate them? So are you saying all 33?
I wouldn't be able to say right now where each local plan was in its development, but it's absolutely our goal that this is here to inform those plans as and when they are developed, and perhaps that's something that Matthew would be able to tell us more about from a Lambeth perspective later. But it's here to support that process, and certainly it's also here to support the guidance that we are developing with boroughs for developing their nighttime strategies as well. So it will absolutely feed into that conversation.
Can I be naughty then and ask you to come back to us and write to us perhaps in September, and just maybe you can have a quick review and just see how many of the boroughs have this in their plans? That'll be really helpful, because again, saying something and actually making it happen, I find across the whole of London is a real challenge. So thank you for that. Moving on to Councillor Bennett, how are you using, or will you use, the cultural infrastructure map, please?
So when I was preparing to come today, the officers in Lambeth wanted me to make sure I stressed how pleased they were to see this being done and how excited they are at what the opportunities the map provides. I think partly because we've been all, as boroughs, but I would say in Lambeth, very proud of our cultural offering, very proud of our cultural heritage, very keen to make sure that we are supporting that culture, but it's not always been easy to see what there is, and something you don't know what you can't see. And while we all feel as councillors and politicians, but also officers who are well embedded in the local community, that we understand where we are, there will be things that we don't know, there will be networks that we're not tapped into, and I think what this does is, first of all, provides the evidence base to start off with to show where everything is. I think secondly what it does is it will immediately prompt conversations where people will say, well, you haven't included us, why aren't we on the map? And it will start to fill in those gaps in a way that is much more comprehensive than would have been done before. And as has been said, will allow us to look kind of area by area. So Brixton is one of the first creative enterprise zones, but it'll enable us to look further down the road into Streatham, into West Norwood, to see where those links are, see what those connections are. So I think we see it as a really useful tool to inform decision making, to look at how our policies are having effect or not having effect. And we're going through our process at the moment of reviewing our local plan and wanting to make sure that we have the follow through from the draft London plan around protecting the nighttime economy and cultural uses. And I think this will make sure that as we're doing that, we're able to see the impact, and over time we'll be able to measure it. And I think when it comes to informed evidence-based policy making, that's really vital. And up until now, it's been piecemeal. I think now it's much more comprehensive, and we welcome it.
Joanne?
I was just going to ask, because I've looked on the website, and Lambeth's culture strategy goes to next year. So are you looking at this alongside developing a new cultural strategy?
Yeah. And we sort of always feel a little bit like we have lots and lots of strategies, and it's the follow-through that's important. So you're right, we are looking at a kind of update on the strategy, but then there's kind of various others that are all touching on the same thing as well. So last year at the National Theatre, we launched our Creative and Digital Industries Growth Strategy, which touched on an awful lot of that and tried to go down from the kind of high-level big business down through to schools, to training, to FE colleges, to embedding that in our very diverse community. And it follows on as well from the Borough of Culture bids that we put in. And it's all sort of tying in, and the thinking is going across everything that we're doing. So we absolutely are looking to make sure we extend beyond. But more importantly, I think it's now being embedded in everything that we're doing. So when we look at economic growth, culture's a key part of that. When we look at education, culture's a key part of that. Skills, culture's a key part of that. And trying to make sure that it's not seen as a kind of an add-on, a nice extra, but it flows through everything that we do.
Okay, so and all that's feeding into this map as well?
I would certainly hope so, yeah.
Thank you. And back to Shonagh. In terms of what are the challenges, please, in safeguarding cultural space, both distinctly in inner London and outer London? What differences apply, please?
I mean, there are challenges which are the same London over. We know the context for this is land value, which is at an all-time high, business rates revaluation, which is affecting businesses wherever they are, reducing capital funding, particularly from, with very stretched local authorities with huge pressures on their priorities, but also from other major funders. There's a drop in lottery receipts, it's affected Arts Council funding. We've got an ageing stock, so no matter where you are, theatres are getting older, there will need to be a kind of refit of those at some point. So we know this is going to grow to be a bigger issue, and that's regardless of whether you are in inner or outer London. Then there's obviously transport development and how that might affect housing development. But I think, in terms of the types of issues which we are dealing with and the kinds of levers and advice that we need to give, they are very similar, no matter where location. They are rising rents, they are business rates revaluation, they are development and the impact of that. And I think that's really important why the map is kind of the shop window in a way of the plan, but the plan runs much deeper than that. And Chair, if it's a good moment, it might be worth me saying a little more about the fullness of what the cultural infrastructure plan is, because I think it's really pertinent to that question. So the map is, as I said, the shop window, but actually the plan itself is an action plan. So it's setting out how London can support and grow cultural infrastructure no matter where it's located. And that is really important for us, that the right support is going to the right organisations in outer London as well as inner London. So there's no single solution to supporting and sustaining it, and the action plan actually focuses on the Mayor's levers, funding, policy, convening, but it also is a call to action for other stakeholders, whether they're boroughs or developers or communities, and how they can act around that. So it includes new policies, it includes research, and it includes funding programmes and tools like the map, which you have seen. So it also includes the most pro-culture draft London plan, as we know. So really, really strong policies like the Agent of Change, which featured in the Creative Tensions report, and a new policy on pubs. We've made a huge leap in terms of how the London plan is set up to support boroughs in protecting cultural infrastructure. So those are activities that are cross-GLA. The cultural infrastructure plan is a cross-GLA approach. So it's a culture regeneration planning opportunity as well as with external partners. So there's an online toolbox. It's got resources for people who need it, and we're developing others as well. So we're developing, there's a set of guidance on creating cultural infrastructure. So what does a good fit out of a theatre or a dance studio look like? So often we fail on cultural infrastructure because it isn't designed right, it isn't costed right. So we're doing some work around that. There's guidance on really important tools for lever and culture. We'll be developing guidance on Section 106 agreements, on SIL. So that's work that we have yet to do and that will be completed later this year. There's research and evidence, so all of the vast data points, the 30,000 data points that Rachel pointed out in the map, and there's the map itself. Then underneath that we've got programmes. There's the Creative Land Trust.
I think we're coming on to a lot of this, so
okay,
I'll stop you there, please, and
then
move on to Naveen. I'm sure who's got questions next.
Yeah, just before I move on to my main question, on the issue about the cultural venues and facilities, particularly in outer London boroughs. Mm-hmm. 2 years ago, we produced this Regeneration Committee, produced a report, Creative Tensions, on culture and creative industries across London. And recommendation 6 in particularly sought Mayor's intervention through the cultural infrastructure plan to protect and enhance smaller venues focused around outer London boroughs, which are under threat because of funding and other resources, mm-hmm. as well as take advantage of the diverse sort of range of cultural activities that we have, and therefore community groups. How has this been addressed within the infrastructure plan and generally as your work plan to actually make it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know, and we talked about some of the challenges which face all organisations in London, but there are specific ones around being in perhaps an outer London borough as well, not least the fact that there are fewer regularly publicly funded organisations in those areas. So they are at times less stable, and there are more issues. So not just through the cultural infrastructure plan, but also through our other policy areas, we've really focused on how we can support outer London. London Borough of Culture has been a huge opportunity to work and focus on really community-led, community-driven cultural activities, and that approach to embedding culture, which Matthew spoke so well about, across a local authorities' responsibilities and powers. So if you look at the leadership that Waltham Forest have been taking with their stepping out as the first London Borough of Culture, you know, when we work with them, we're working with their regeneration team. They are embedding policy changes. They've actually taken the approach of embedding culture across all of the council departments and responsibilities. So they're really looking at the legacy of that programme. And at the same time, they're also funding community work. So they've had fantastic success through their fellowship funding programme. They've put £500,000 aside for those projects, and they are truly fantastic, and there'll be lots of opportunity throughout the year to engage with those programmes, really community-led. We've learned a huge amount through our Culture Seeds funding programme as well about the strength and the quality of diverse-led community cultural activities across London. We've made grants, it's a micro-grants programme, so it's for community-led projects, or it can be for individuals who are leading that activity. We're working now in 30 London boroughs through that programme, and again, there's just huge opportunity there. So it really is about seeding that bedrock, seeding that grassroots work. And then also, within the context of infrastructure, there's been fantastic significant investment through the Good Growth Fund. It's clearly not our policy area to speak to, but for the cultural sector, that fund has been hugely significant, particularly in the context of reducing capital funding that I talked about earlier. And a great deal of that has been in outer London areas as well, and that's hugely important as the next round for that continues later this year.
If I can move on to my question now, and that's about Mayor's major regeneration programs across London. And that includes London Legacy Development, LLDC. You got OPDC, Old Oak Park, Royal MDC, and of course the Royal Docks. Yeah, if you can just focus on two key areas for now. First one is OPDC, which obviously is the biggest regeneration program, major housing and job creation, sort of with HS2 and Crossrail 2 as the sort of central aspect of the regeneration. That is what will those two infrastructure projects will provide. Now the question is, whilst it is at an early stage, but that is where I want to know from you how much of work is being done to make sure that culture-led regeneration will provide. So A, what work you are doing with the current MDC at Old Oak and Park Royal, as well as what are the key deliveries that you would be seeking over the overall program in terms of social infrastructure and everything else that is part of culture-led regeneration.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, it is clearly, as you set out, an enormous opportunity. From a regeneration and a culture perspective, there's also an enormous amount at shift, and you also identify very rightly that it's at very early stages in its development. The great opportunity in OPDC over the last 18 months has been through its Great Places programme. So that's an Arts Council funded engagement programme, which is really focusing again on trying to capacity build and raise awareness around cultural opportunities for the local community. So not about kind of focusing on cultural infrastructure at this point, but really looking at where the creativity in the local area sits and how that can be brought out. There's also been some good growth investment in the area around Wilson Junction, and that's really focused on kind of celebrating the industrial heritage of the area. So there, the aims and the objectives of the OPDC culture and heritage programs would be closely aligned with the culture strategy. It's at a very early point in its development. If you compare it to somewhere like Royal Docks, where they are much further on down the line in terms of what that, how they're going to develop that strategy. So
No, I think it's important that at this very early planning stage, that this becomes inherent part of planning delivery.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's always an afterthought. You rely on Section 106 or SIL money and so on. Doesn't quite deliver because there are other priorities as well. So unless it is part of the delivery right from the beginning, it won't happen, which will be a huge loss. Moving on to Royal Docks, obviously the whole of planning and thought process started in 2010 and before. 2010 there were various applications like one for Silver Town Quays, etc., being sort of granted. I'm not sure, well, it appears that not a lot has happened. First, I want to sort of ask about one particular major site, which is the Millennium Mills, which unfortunately, a Grade 2 listed, very significant heritage building, has been left derelict. There were 4 fires, I believe, previously in the building. This is from London Fire Brigade. In the last 12 months or so, there's been a fire on 23rd, about 4 days ago, on the same site. Now, when you look at the consent, that is for part demolition of the building, but conversion then for a major spaces for SMEs. Now, that is part of important delivery together with some of the other consent which talks about leisure and culture, as well as some part of community use element. Can you tell us how much of, again, partnership working you have with the developing arm, as well as the GLA delivery, to make sure that, again, in Royal Docks, there's huge opportunity and that is not lost. Because when I see the neglect, almost like criminal neglect of major heritage assets like Millennium Mills, it makes me worried. And again, if we are serious about delivering Mayor's vision for culture, we cannot afford to sort of not have a serious program on major sites where we deliver on our publicly owned sites.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I completely agree. I mean, these are opportunities absolutely not to be missed. And I'm really pleased that our team have been able to be involved with the Royal Docks team in developing the tender and in the appointment process for the consultants who will help them to take forward the cultural placemaking strategy for that area. So that appointment has been made and that strategy is now in development. It's absolutely clear that the Mayor's culture strategy is the basis. I mean, Royal Docks is a hugely important component of that, and the goals in that strategy are absolutely the context for that placemaking strategy, which will take in all of that local opportunity and context. I mean, it is it's an area that is so rich in opportunity, you know, potential for 4,000 new homes, 35,000 new jobs, but it's also an area that at the moment has very low levels of cultural engagement. It lacks a cultural hub. There's a huge infrastructure job to do there from a cultural perspective. So we've been working with them in two ways. One is in looking at how that strategy is developed and how it can really make the most of those assets and answer those concerns and be aligned with the Mayor's culture strategy. And the other is on their programme as it develops. So they will go into an engagement mode this year, and they will have just recently announced or are announcing the programme for that. And that really will focus on thinking about that audience engagement, providing opportunities for family-led programming, providing opportunities and commissioning work from local communities, from diverse groups. That's going to be the focus of that first summer approach to programming. So really, again, a really important bedrock for bringing in the right conversations for what that longer-term culture strategy should look like.
Can I please request that you talk to your GLA colleagues and let us know what exactly is planned in terms of delivery of culturally sort of led uses for for Royal Docks. Yeah, because I have got an extent planning consent here, which gives a whole host of uses. We want to be clear what actually what actually is being planned for Millennium Mills, and what are the other elements, including scale of other cultural uses for the whole of the Royal Docks. Yeah, mm-hmm. If you can please let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joanne?
Mine was to Shonagh. You talked about theatres earlier, and I'm just wondering what influence you have on boroughs' planning. For example, you have theatres who, like professional theatres that sell tickets day in, day out. Then you have those other spaces known as local theatres where amateur dramatic societies or the local scouts may put on Christmas pantos and stuff, but are not a theatre in a professional sense. I've got one in my area, the Intimate Theatre in Palmer's Green, where the church that owns that site wants to demolish it and obviously build housing and get revenue from it. And so there's a bit of a local battle going on at the moment, and I'm just wondering what sort of influence you have over sites like that as opposed to the professional theatres.
The kinds of, the Mayor isn't a funder, so there aren't funding levers that we can pull, but we are, there is a great power in convening, and actually what we're able to do here is bring together the right individuals from across a set of policy areas. So that might be from the Communities and Social Policy team, or it might be from the Education and Youth team, or it might be from planning, or it might be from the Regeneration team, so that We can get to the specifics of what the tussle is. You know, is it a rent negotiation? Is it about a development? Who do we need to help that community group think about whether or not they're in a position to list as an asset of community value, for example? That's something we've been able to advise on and help community-led groups to achieve. And that can be really, really crucial to a set of negotiations about tenancy, for example.
No, I know your team has been given some advice. So that is appreciated. But it's just the difference between some of the venues and particularly... Okay. Thanks.
And your questions now and then.
Yeah. You finished, Davin? Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask about cultural enterprise zones. And my questions first are to Matthew. Because Lambeth is one of the 6 zones that the culture team, the GLA, chose. Can you just tell us a little bit about the progress you've made so far and what are your hopes as to what being a cultural enterprise zone, what would that actually do for the borough?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the question. We're really excited that Brixton was one of the first CZs chosen by the Mayor, and we were especially pleased to welcome the Mayor and the culture team to Lambeth Town Hall to launch them. I think it gave the game away that we were going to be one of the winners, but we didn't mind a bit of foreshadowing. I think the exciting thing for us is the way that the Mayor's kind of cultural agenda here is aligned very much with our own thinking, and there's a real sense of kind of shared purpose and shared endeavour between the GLA and Lambeth in trying to bring this forward. Because we've seen, I was taking when Shonagh was talking about kind of levers that there are, one of the issues we've had is where we don't have levers to be able to protect local business or creative space. So permitted development rights have been a huge, hugely damaging in Lambeth, as they have been across all of London. And in Brixton alone, we lost about 24,000 square foot of office space, which, if you look kind of average density, one worker per 120 square foot, that's 200 jobs gone in our town centre, which then has a knock-on effect to increase rent levels. We then had the increase in business rates, and where market rents in Brixton are relatively low compared to central London, it's kind of 35, 36 pounds a square foot. An awful lot of cultural businesses are looking more at 10 to 20 pounds a square foot, or they're operating in a kind of social enterprise space. And so clearly the market is not responding to that need because it's taking the highest price. So our focus for the Brixton CZ was around 3 key priorities: space, jobs, and then talent. So all 3 linked together. So taking them in turn, when it comes to space, we've had for a while now a programme of trying to produce our own affordable workspace for local businesses and charities and social enterprises. That's a programme called Lambeth Works. And within Brixton, we've really tried to focus that on creative enterprises, digital enterprises, and on tech. So we've now got 2 council-owned affordable workspaces in Brixton. One is within our recently refurbished town hall. So we've opened that up and given space over to local startups in a space called Tripod, which is run by Meanwhile Space. That's fully occupied and fully let. 78% of the businesses there were from local Brixton or Lambeth residents. The others have moved into Brixton and created jobs there. And it's been used not only as a place for kind of established local creative businesses to have very affordable space, but also through hot desking for local startups or individuals to come in and have access to those networks. And we've used it, kind of going on to the talent and job side of things, to also try and provide space for networking and engagement with groups who are less well represented. So if you go into our schools, every language on earth is spoken in Lambeth schools, people from all over the world, all over the country. You go into some of our tech and creative businesses and it's full of skinny white boys in their 20s with MacBooks, and there's a massive disconnect there in terms of talent and representation. So there's an organisation called UK Black Tech who we've been working closely with, and actually the man who runs that has come in to help advise us on talent and skills development, not just within the CEZ but within the borough. And we've organised events there that he's run to bring people in to have those connections to other businesses, to get access into those networks that otherwise they'd be excluded from. And I think about 350 people have attended those sorts of events that we've held in the town hall. Secondly, we've very recently launched the largest affordable workspace in Europe, which is in Brixton International House, which is an 11-storey, 48,000 square foot building. We're running that with an organisation called 3 Space, and they are bringing in a really wide range of different groups and different organisations, and it's a really interesting mix as you go up through the floors of that building. We've got people like Assemble, who won the Turner Prize not that long ago, have taken a whole floor and are using that to set up a space for fabrics and fashion business, which when you think about the range of, you go into Brixton Market and it's full of, you know, kente cloth and all sorts of different fabrics from all over the world. Being able to link that up with people who have access in the major arts world and the kind of high-level Turner Prize winning right down to kind of local culture is hugely important for us. Bringing organisations like Business Launchpad, who are a youth entrepreneurship charity focusing on 16 to 30-year-olds. They've moved into that building. An organisation called Iconic Steps, who work predominantly with young people who want to work in media, and they were previously based up at the BFI, which is in Lambeth, but was able to bring back those connections and expertise into that building. And then alongside all of that, we have space for local charities and social enterprises, startups, individuals, hot desking, all of that. And it's having a really positive impact locally. There's space there for about 850 jobs. And we've just had it accredited by the Living Wage Foundation as the first living wage building in the country. So everyone who works there has to be paid at least the London living wage. And all the businesses who start off there, even if it's just a one-man, one-woman band, have to be accredited. So when they go out and expand, they'll be taking on staff at least the London living wage. So using that as a hook, not just in the local economy, but also a hook into the creative economy. Because as those businesses go out there and operating in that economy, be it in Brixton, be it in Lambeth, be it across London, they'll be taking that best practice with them. When it comes on to jobs and talent, obviously all the affordable workspace comes with a huge number of jobs that are being created there, but talent we see is absolutely vital for the reasons I was talking about a minute ago. So next week, we have got our launch of Elevate, which came out of the Next Generation grant that we got from the Borough of Culture bid, which is looking very much at embedding cultural education and links into cultural industries within our schools. We've got the start of our first local cultural education partnership, where we are working with BFI, National Theatre, Ballet Ramba, South Bank Centre, so all the major cultural institutions on the North Bank and on the South Bank, and trying to bring that locally and provide those connections. And we would like to see a 30% uplift in schools who have the Arts Mark accreditation as a result of that. And we've also got next, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend, our second running of the ERIC Festival, which is a creative and digital industries employment fair. It's not like your standard job fairs. It's very much driven by young people and what they want to see. And we ran it last year up in Vauxhall. This year we're holding it in Brixton itself, taking advantage of the Creative Enterprise Zone, holding it in Pop Brixton, which is another sort of affordable workspace and food and drink venue within the borough. So we're seeing sort of multiple different streams of activity all moving forward at pace. And being able to badge that underneath it being a Creative Enterprise Zone and having that platform and recognition across London is really beneficial for us. It gives it an extra bit of clout, extra prominence, extra credibility when we go out and talk about those things. And it's not just Lambeth trying to promote itself, it's that it comes with kind of accreditation and credibility from elsewhere. And then I think we'll probably look to do a kind of formal launch in the autumn, which you would all be very welcome to come to, where we will try and bring all of that together and also set the path over the next couple of years about how that continues to develop.
Okay, so you're looking at it in the round about economic development, new talent.
Yeah.
And what about those areas outside the zone that perhaps have low levels of participation in cultural activities? What are you trying to do about that, spreading the good work across the borough?
So I think that's a really interesting question. So when we're going, as I said, we're going through the process of reviewing our local plan at the moment, and we identified in West Norwood, in the south of Lambeth, we've got one of the largest, we call them KEBAs, key industrial business areas, industrial and workspace areas in the borough, which for a number of reasons has struggled in various ways, and we thought actually identifying this as Lambeth's second creative enterprise zone would be an excellent way to revitalise it. There's a little bit of a tussle over who has control over the name Creative Enterprise Zone, but ultimately what we're trying to do is take the learning from Brixton and the best practice that's there and transplant that elsewhere into the borough and look at how we can embed creative workspace uses within industrial areas, within high streets, to try and stimulate them and make sure that they survive. I think you also look at other areas, so Streatham, again in the south of Lambeth. We've just put in a bid to the government's Better High Street Fund. And one of the bids we put in is around Streatham Theatre, which is one of the kind of large Victorian theatres that then became a bingo hall, and it's been various things, and now sits fairly derelict. And I think 10 years ago, the simple route would have been to have just converted it into residential uses, and everyone would have said, well, at least the building's preserved in heritage terms. Now, actually, we're looking at it and saying, well, we should be looking at it as a space for performance, in the sort of performances that you're talking about, in local groups who don't have access to those kind of spaces. But also looking to say, well, how fantastic to have creative enterprises there, to have connections in for set design and all those sorts of creative uses that are there, as well as providing just general workspace for the high street. So I think those connections are there, and we're starting to see them push through into other bits of the council. And we structure our regeneration teams around neighbourhoods, so the other teams who aren't working on Brixton are looking at it and thinking, well, how do we get those sorts of benefits into Vauxhall? How do we get them into Waterloo? How do we get them to Streatham and West Norwood? And I think it's having a very positive effect.
Okay, you seem very excited, and it seems like you're using culture as a catalyst for further regeneration. Can I ask then, what has been the value of the GLA spending money in this, and could you have done this without that assistance or help?
So obviously pride makes me want to say that of course we could have done it on our own. I think the reality is, that there's sort of whole chain of events, and one of the biggest catalysts for us was the Borough of Culture bid. Because there's always a temptation when you've got success stories that you point to your success stories and say, well, we're successful there, so let's focus on something else. And in Lambeth, we've got all those institutions along the South Bank. We've got the kind of international names that are all sitting there. The temptation was there to be able to say, well, of course we're strong on culture. Look at the South Bank. Actually, the Borough of Culture bid flipped everything on its head, and we looked much more at the local level, much more about cultures everywhere. And what was most exciting for me through all of that process was going to all of the meetings locally where we were asking people to come in and contribute their ideas. And the range of ideas and the diversity of people that came wasn't your usual crowd that we had normally coming into kind of public meetings. It was drawing people in a way where people felt very passionate and very excited about advocating for their, not even town centre, their neighbourhood, their estate, around the culture that was there, around the small little groups that they had, and how that all linked in. And I think that has prompted an awful lot of thinking about the way that we work, about looking at a sort of much more granular level, around recognising, that you don't need to go after the huge project with the big ribbon that you can cut. There's smaller things happening locally that can have quite significant impact. And it's sometimes harder to be able to explain that as a series of successes because you haven't got one big project. But actually that way of thinking has been really useful. And then, across the whole relationship with the GLA, the Good Growth Fund has been, again, another catalyst for starting to think about how spaces are brought back into use. So if people know Brixton, and Brixton Rec in particular is a huge and kind of fantastic building. It's listed, but it's also bizarrely designed on the inside. There's all sorts of strange spaces that you would never normally think were there. And actually the Good Growth Fund is enabling us to turn some sort of old redundant storage space there into affordable workspace and creative space. Now we could have maybe found ways of doing that, but actually Good Growth Fund has prompted us to look at that and how we can multiply our own impact locally. And when you think about what the uses are, being able to focus much more on those kind of cultural uses and justify them and not just say, in the way that 10 years ago people used to say, culture was for other people. Actually, we're being able to justify and root that very locally and advocate that.
We have people in this building that say the mayor shouldn't be spending money on culture, or he's spending too much. What would your answer be to those? I
think we can see the impact locally, that spending on culture and investment in culture is hugely recognised by local people as being valuable. It's having very profound, important economic impacts. And more than that, it's recognising the ability for particularly our young people to have careers of their choosing that accentuate their own talents and allow them to live really fulfilling lives. And I think that's what we're in politics for.
Thank you.
Thank you for that point. And moving on, Naveen.
Yeah, mine is about the creative land trust questions. Yeah. First of all, can you explain what is the sort of purpose, the objective of creative land trust, and then go on to explain how it works, what progress it has made since February this year when it was set up, and Mayor's funding commitments for at least a couple of years that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Creative Land Trust was set up really in responds to the really dire loss of affordable creative workspace that we've identified through your research and the report and through the cultural infrastructure plan. I mean, we know we face losing up to 30% of creative workspace. And we know that that is a huge issue for the ecology in London, for the economy, but also from a community perspective, as we've been hearing through those Lambeth opportunities. So Creative Land Trust is one of a suite of measures within that creative infrastructure plan looking at workspace specifically. So it's an independent organisation. The Mayor is one of a suite of funders, both public and private, who are investing in that. And quite simply, it will identify and buy buildings and then lease them as affordable studios or workspace. And in some case, it might co-purchase buildings directly with workspace providers. So the kind of issues it's trying to address are that it's incredibly hard. If you are a workspace provider operating in London, the property market moves exceptionally fast. It's competitive. All of the research has found that it's exceptionally difficult for those kinds of good bets from a loan perspective to access that finance quickly. So the CLT is intended to be a way of moving much more quickly to secure loans and financing around buying buildings, so the opportunities will increase for workspace providers. It launched in February, as you said. The goal is that it will help to secure 1,000 workspaces in its first 5 years.
Sorry, how many? 2,000?
1,000, yeah. There's £7.5 million of grant funding confirmed in there already. That includes 4 million from the Mayor, but it's going to seek to raise another 10 million from social impact investment in the first 3 to 5 years. So one of the purposes of launching at the point that it did in February was so that it could set out its stall and launch a call for potential pilot projects. So we went out there and we said, do you have a building, a site, an opportunity that you think is an opportunity for investment? And we had 91 responses to that. So there's an interim director and team in place. They've been working on building that pipeline for the moment. There's a recruitment of trustees, which is underway. So they've been interviewing, and very shortly we'll be able to appoint a board. The trust has secured its charity commission status, so it's now a fully fledged charity. And it's been piecing together and building its relationship with investors. So it's really kind of setting everything in train. It's been a productive time.
Sustainability is a big issue, particularly for the existing artist studios and similar workplaces, and certainly new where, for example, what you will be creating, what your plans are. Question is, how sustainable is it? Because you mentioned there'll be some freehold and some leasehold. What kind of leases you will have, and can we actually be reassured or be assured that these will be sustainable spaces, affordable spaces? Because that's a big issue. We've had this, with Hackney Wick, where there's a lot of aspirations. There's some great work being done in Barking, Dagenham, etc. But it is a matter of, either through gentrification, when you get large projects, the existing artists are sort of basically moved out, and they lose their workspaces. So it is a question of protecting the existing as well as creating ones which are sustainable. So how will this work?
I left out the most important point about Creative Land Trust, which is that those buildings and opportunities that are secured will be in perpetuity, and that will be a condition of that funding. So that's a really, really important element, and it's also what differentiates it. So this is about establishing workspace for the long term. Absolutely.
We have 2 years funding agreed, 1 million per annum from the Mayor's side. What happens after 2 years? And did you say overall, how much is it, the actual current fund that you are...
There's 4 million committed from the Mayor. I mean, that's a finite commitment. It's intended as seed funding as set up, so it's not an ongoing funding situation. And this is an independent trust, so it's writing its business model at the moment, digging into that. It's had excellent advice, but the idea is that has a multitude of stakeholders and that the Mayor has played a role in helping to found that.
What kind of buy-in you have from major kind of artist organizations? Would you have that expertise or that input from artists from London? I don't know how would it work, whether they're on your board or panel or whatever, to actually guide you and tell you what the priorities should be or what they are actually seeking.
Absolutely. I mean, well, there are two key links in that, I guess. One is that the Arts Council are a funder of this, and that's huge representation of both artist workspace providers and artists through that route. The other is that this has a very direct link with the Workspace Providers Board here at the GLA. Another partner in it is Outset, the Contemporary Art Fund. So they also bring with them a kind of huge set of credentials around the artist community, and their feed into that and the kind of consultation that's happened in shaping the Creative Land Trust. And the other learnings that we've looked at were learnings that were identified through the World Cities Culture Forum in San Francisco. There's a really fantastic model called the Community Arts Stabilization Trust, which was really the seed of the idea on which Creative Land Trust was based. And that has had huge feed-in from artist advice and has a really kind of local focus as well.
Well, one question comes to my mind. How would you will you be able to determine that there's good spread across London rather than focus in one particular part of London and still achieving your target? Because it's important that there's good distribution of these facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Mayor is a very major funder and stakeholder in that process. It will have an independent board. It has a very clear strategy in its priorities for London. With the Arts Council on board, there's obviously a much longer term picture about how Creative Land Trust might be relevant nationally as well. But I think what will be really exciting to see in those pilot projects that come forward is about where that potential is, and I have no doubt that there'll be a wealth of outer London borough opportunity when we look at the context out there. Absolutely.
We'd certainly be very, very interested in kind of regular follow-up or feedback from your end to see how this is going, so that we are able to A, be informed, and B, we can monitor and contribute and come back to you if there are issues and do what we can from committee level. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on to the culture team budget, please. Most of the budget for the creative enterprise zones comes under the programme rather than capital funding. What type of expenditure is covered by the category programme funding? Does this include both capital and revenue funding, please?
Yes. I mean, some of the detail it's probably wiser for me to come back to you on. Obviously, we're working across 6 areas. We're in the process of negotiating and finalising the grant agreements. In that process, we've been negotiating how that funding can be applied. What we found in the application process was, A, we had this wealth of demand. We had 25 boroughs apply. We then worked with 11 through the research phase, so we were able to invest across 11 boroughs. And when it came to the shortlisting, the demand was, the opportunity was so great that we were kind of able, stroke had to, support 6. So we've enabled that by bringing in extra ESF funding so that we can develop the skills components of that programme, which has helped really substantially. But what it means is that we are now in a process of piecing together exactly how that funding is best applied. But it's across a range of areas, so it might be around helping boroughs to experiment with business rates. It might be around securing affordable workspace. Some of it is around community and skills engagement. But I think what is really interesting when you look at how those budgets are applied is what that group of the first creative enterprise zones as leaders can learn from each other and help other boroughs to learn from. So the other strand of the creative enterprise zone programme that is really important is a learning and sharing strand, and part of that will be about those boroughs. So we've got a forum happening here at City Hall later this week where we are regularly bringing those boroughs together to take case studies, to kind of talk and communicate about what they're doing, to kind of learn and take from each other's approaches, to think about what's relevant. But each of those areas is absolutely distinct. What you'll see happening in Croydon is very different from what you'll see happening in Lambeth or in Hackney Wick and Fish Island or in Tottenham. So there's great opportunity, and then we'll be doing a broader, probably a more annual process of taking that and sharing it more widely with what we now know are really interested parties in the rest of the boroughs. So we really hope that it'll have influence, quite far-reaching influence, particularly around policy application and what can be learnt around that. So areas where funding is not necessarily the answer.
Thank you. And what are the risks to the GLA arising from the Creative Enterprise Zones funding, particularly if the programme funding is revenue focused?
We have deliberately chosen to shape it in the way that we have. What we know also from the intake is that there is great capital demand within that, but we were very open in the application process about what boroughs were applying for. In the main, what many of the boroughs have needed is human resource to take that forward, and so there have been a number of recruitment processes happening, and getting the right support in place around that and the right talent in place around that will be really important to delivering that. What we also need from those boroughs, and what we are finding in spades, is real buy-in from the council leadership, because this is a cross-policy programme as well, so it doesn't work if it sits over here in one particular area. So quite often those roles haven't been based in culture teams at all. They've been based in economic development teams, or they've been based in regeneration teams. So we have been having fantastic meetings with the Deputy Mayor and the council leaders across the board, where we're seeing huge appetite for the potential of the programme, and that's really important to its success. If that wasn't there, that would be a huge risk. Thank you, and I'm sure you would be to answer the next question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is it expected that the GLA will fund the Creative Land Trust beyond 2020-21? There isn't a current expectation of that. It's seed funding that has been given, and the Trust does need to go out there and raise its income, yeah. Great, thank you. Last but not least, Assembly Member Arbour's questions.
Yes, arising from, if I go on to that, arising from things that have been said, I noticed Councillor Bennett's incredible enthusiasm. Clearly it's first Lambeth in the world, but the truth of the matter is that all of this is enthusiasm for something which is starting up. You've described it yourself as a sort of catalyst and so on. And it's exactly as my colleague Navin has said, sustainability is the thing. I've lived through very many of these kinds of things, which have all started with that same kind of incredible enthusiasm, and this really applies to all of you, and the enormous success it's going to be, and then it hit the buffers. If I can give you a recent example, which I assume is giving you considerable concern already, is the Rose in Kingston, which when it was set off, you know, great expectations, wonderful community backing, wonderful financial backing, and at the end of the day, when things aren't working out well, they come back to the principal people who are the council taxpayers. And it may be that all these wonderful things in Brixton, which you have described to us, may come back and bite the council taxpayers of Lambeth at the end, because the thing isn't going successfully. I'm sure that so long as you're there, it won't happen. But I think that, you know, it's right that we should be absolutely certain to build up procedures which ensure that the enthusiasm, which of course will eventually level out, is there to maintain the thing. But the question that I have is that, of course, originally there was a proposal to double your staffing, pretty much an increase, I think, of more than 50% full-time equivalents, which you didn't get. So the first question is, has that hobbled you in any way, or were you simply being carried away by enthusiasm in putting in the biggest bid you could possibly think of?
Thank you, Assembly Member Arbour. I come here with humility. And, you know, I think that was, you know, firstly we listened, you know, a great set of views were had around that proposal. I mean, I think what's important to recognise is that we do have the opportunity of the most ambitious culture strategy. to date, and it is also a long-term strategy. You know, it has really deep embedded opportunities like we're discussing here today, and we understand and we hear the feedback that we need to be incredibly we need to prioritise in the current environment. So, you know, we've heard the concerns that we've raised, we've heard the priorities that the Assembly has, and we've prioritised around those. So the first thing that the restructure, just to round off what then practically happened, we did come back with a restructure proposal which was approved, which had a small growth of £34,000 in it. But what it enabled us to do was to reimagine the team. So we were able, you know, we came from a base where we only had 30%. We had 9 permanent roles in the team, which was a huge risk around delivery. What we were able to do is establish the right roles in the team, the right skills. We increased the diversity of the team through that process. We've gone from 9% BAME members, for example, to 21%, and I know that that's going to improve even still further. We were able to look at, so that made us more efficient. Having the right roles made us more efficient. We also then started to look at the processes. What were we doing? How were we doing it? How are we communicating it? The GLA has also been looking at its processes. The combination of that has also really helped. So all of this has been taking place across the last year. We then were realistic. So we looked at our budgets. Where could we find efficiencies? Where could we reimagine through those? But most importantly, we did have to stop some things. And again, you know, we heard the Assembly members' priorities. We have liaised, obviously, extremely closely with the Mayor's office around their priorities. There have been some areas which have enormous potential, which are paused. You know, we have some opportunities which we've not been able to grow. For example, around the arts and health agenda, the health team here are doing some really fantastic work, which we've been able to support, and there have been some great outcomes. But mostly we've been embedding that work through what we can do in London Borough of Culture and Culture Seeds, for example. Another area is around greening the creative industries. Again, thinking about how we can work with our existing creative industries grants, rather than looking at taking on ambitious new areas of work. But there are huge opportunities out there. But I think we can be really confident that we're delivering the right priorities by listening to what those are from the Assembly and from the Mayor's office.
It could have been a blessing in disguise, couldn't it? Us saying that you should look at other ways of funding things. You've talked a lot about partner organisations, recruiting trustees and all of that kind of thing. It is a feature, isn't it, and always has been in London, that culture has been a voluntary thing, in the sense that it hasn't come from the public sector. You only have to look at our great art galleries, theatre. Pretty well everything hasn't come from taxpayers. It's come from philanthropy of one kind or another. And sometimes the philanthropists are fashionable and sometimes they're not fashionable, and they say, no, we don't want your money. I sincerely hope that the GLA isn't going to, you know, you're not going to say to people like BP, no, we don't want your money. I'm sure they won't say that in Lambeth. If BP were to offer Lambeth money, though I can't be sure.
Like I said, we were the first borough in London to declare a climate emergency, so we take climate change very seriously.
Yeah, so you wouldn't,
So have
you
we,
would,
Tony.
you really? Oh, isn't that awful? Oh my gosh! I'm sure that Westminster and KNC will continue to take money from. Anyway, that's irrelevant. The point I'm making, the point I'm making, is that in general, culture in London has not depended on public funds, and in the case that I've cited in one of the boroughs that I represent, when the thing fails, a cultural enterprise fails, they have to come back onto the council taxpayer, or the thing closes, or the thing closes down. And I'm really want to know about how you are going to create the sustainability of having funding from outside. Certainly in my experience as a borough councillor, I always took the view that in the old days, if the GLC was funding it, it didn't really matter because they would always pay. And I would not like to think that in the future people are going to come along and say, oh, well, the GLA's funding it, the Mayor's funding it, whoever that Mayor may be, and therefore we can take our foot off the pedal. Yeah, it's always one of the difficulties when there's public funding. Do you have any fears about that kind of thing?
Well, thank you very much for your question. I think, I mean, one of the interesting characteristics of the culture strategy, the Mayor's culture strategy, is that, you know, in fact, the GLA is a very, very small funder of culture in London. I mean, you know, the culture unit's budget is just over 1% of the whole of the GLA's budget, but we are actually not a funder of culture per se. In fact, 50% of the culture unit's budgets go to local authorities through our local authority programmes. So it's a really interesting situation. One of the things we're also really conscious of is obviously Brexit is going to, and probably already is, having a huge impact on philanthropy. I mean, we are not in the same position as our cousins in America in terms of how philanthropy contributes to arts organisations, but it is a really hugely important developing area. I mean, it's the lifeblood for some organisations, and so you're right to raise there are very difficult questions to be asked around how that funding can be encouraged. What might the tax breaks be that the government needs to consider around philanthropy? For example, you know, how could the Mayor support or intervene or lobby in those areas? But, you know, we are going to have to continue to work with stakeholders who run arts organisations and cultural organisations that have extremely different business models. You know, we have everything from the large funded institutions who have statutory or core government grants, right through to small organisations who perhaps get, or other organisations who get an Arts Council grant, so receive public funding that might be 5 or 6% of their total turnover. These are organisations, you know, who are in very precarious
It's true.
situations.
I mean, I absolutely understand what you're saying. You know, it's the seed funding, I mean, it's the catalyst and all of that kind of thing. But the truth of the matter is, if I was a trustee of one of these bodies and I was even getting the tiniest 6% or whatever the figure may be from the GLA, that's the most incredible covenant for when I want to go elsewhere. I say, oh, well, the Mayor's giving me something, you know, and that ought to be enough to lever the money out again. And it may lead, I've seen it over many years, for people at the end of the day perhaps becoming overly dependent on public funds. They're not so enthusiastic. The specific question I have to ask, and you may have answered it when we were talking about how you have adjusted to not getting your staffing bid, what precisely is the full-time equivalent that you who are currently employed in your unit by the GLA?
I don't have the FTE with me, but we've got 34 roles. I should say we've got 34 roles on the establishment.
Yes.
We've had some great promotion opportunities and we've got some new programmes starting, so they're not all in place at the moment. But so it'd be something like, I don't know, 32. I can come back to you with the FTE.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
I mean, final words?
Indeed, final word. I mean, I come from a somewhat different position from my colleague Tony on the whole funding aspects and the important role that culture plays in parts of our lives. The obvious distinct benefits of cultural development within our communities, within where we live, etc. But indeed, as it says in our report, in the beginning paragraph, that the huge economic impact and benefit culture and creative industries provide. It says here that creative industries in London alone generated 52.2 billion gross value added in 2071 and accounts for 1/6 in jobs in capital. So that is something which is major contribution towards the economy and the benefits you get from that. And I also believe that in promoting culture, everyone has a stake. And therefore, public sector, in my view, has to be one of those stakeholders where we provide leadership, we provide that vision that is necessary, and obviously allocate that level of funding as well. Now, I will be the first one to admit that I sit on the Oversight Committee, and when that first proposal came to us, I was the one to say, no, this is not on. That was purely because of the timing. It was ill-conceived because it wasn't considered within the sort of budget of the GLA, etc. And I'm glad that after negotiations that we've had, very productive sort of work that was done afterwards behind the scenes, that we now have that required enhancement to deliver the element impact of culture. Chair, on that note, I will conclude. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to agree with both of you. There you go. I should be a Liberal Democrat, shouldn't I? Can I thank our guests for their attendance and very helpful contributions to the discussion? Thank you very much for coming. Can we agree to note the areas for consideration set out in paragraph 4.1, note the report and discussion, delegate my authority to me in consultation with my Deputy Chair to agree any output for the meeting?
Great.
Thank you very much. Work programme, can we note the progress of the work programme as set out in the report, please? Thank you. And the next meeting slot is Tuesday the 23rd of July. Any other business? I have no urgent business. Thank you very much.
GLA Chamber Sound.